Alrighty, thank you all for coming. I'm Summer, I'm the curator here at the museum. Before we get started, reminder to please turn off or silence your phones so we don't have any disruptions. One quick announcement for October, we're going to be having ghost tours on both Fridays and Saturdays. Usually we only have them on Fridays, so some extra opportunities there. And as for upcoming programs, next Friday, September 16th, we will have a temporary exhibit opening. The exhibit is called Franklintown, the South End's African American Legacy, and it examines the history of Franklintown, which was a community of free Black Amelia Island residents, which started after the Civil War and lasted until the 1970s. And the exhibit opening will feature a panel of previous Franklintown residents talking about their memories growing up there. And then our October Brown Bag Lunch on October 5th will be with Chris Bogosh, who will speak about John Muir's journey through our area. Muir is known as the father of our national parks. So that's it for announcements, but today we have Rebecca Dominguez-Karimi. Dr. Dominguez-Karimi has a PhD in comparative studies from Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. She specializes in oral history, Mexican American studies, restorative justice, and gender studies. A writer, podcaster, and public speaker, she presents all across the state of Florida and virtually across the United States. So everyone, please welcome Rebecca.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you guys today. And thank you for the invitation, Summer. I usually start off my podcast with, Hola, amigos. Somos familia. We are family. And that's one thing I'd like to stress. We are all one big multicultural family. So that's what we're going to be sharing today. And I'm going to discuss the latest project that I have here in Jacksonville, in the Jacksonville area, and it's called Celebremos lo que Somos, Hispanic Voices of Northeast Florida.
Sorry.
The first slide. What I have been doing has been documenting a lost and forgotten past for the Hispanics of this area. During the heyday of the Cuban, the Cuban community in Jacksonville, there were cigar factories, there were tailor shops, there were all sorts of different businesses that the Cuban community participated in. But since then, they kind of left with the Cuban Revolution of Jose Marti, and so, as you can see, and as I discovered, there's been a major gap there in the Hispanic history of the area. So next slide, please. I was able to track down, thanks to the Jacksonville Public Library and then also several professors from the FSCJ, one Jose Wu, I think is how he pronounced his name. He was a Cuban patriot, and he was Cuban born, obviously, and he immigrated to the Jacksonville area in the, I want to say, at least in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And as I said, he was very much the patriot. And he had the Wu, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, cigar factory, and he made the Modelo cigars. They employed at one point in time around 225 people there at their factory, so you figure that there were quite a number of Cubans in the area. So he died in 1905 in Jacksonville, and there was even a write-up in the newspaper. And a lot of these facts that I'm getting are from the Jackson Thomas Davis in his column that he writes. Okay, so then Pedro Mendez, founded his own tailor shop in the Masonic Lodge that was there in Jacksonville. And in 1927, Manuel Rivera opened Manuel's Tap Room. So these were the two businesses and families from the Cubans that were left over that stayed in the area. And of course, in 1921 and all the way through 1960 until the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban consulate was occupied in Springfield area, and it was the same consul was Julio R. Embil. Now, Jacksonville Historical Society was fortunate enough that they got a lot of the documents from the council. But unfortunately, whenever I was looking for them, so many of them that we looked at didn't have anything in writing on them. So we're kind of like lost. And I don't think anyone is around anymore that would be able to identify the individuals. But for what it's worth, they're there. Okay, so, oops, I messed up my own iPad here. I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties with my iPad.
Do you need me to help?
Let's see, we are on slide 3, Hispanics that stayed in Jacksonville. Now I should be able to press it. Okay. The missing history. Next slide, please. The missing history of Hispanics in Jacksonville, Florida. And a mystery it certainly is. From 1927 through 2022, that's almost 100 years, there's a gap that exists. And so I always, like I say, consider history like a puzzle. You put the pieces together. Some pieces you might find immediately. Others are damaged and they don't fit quite right, while others, you can't find them no matter where, unless you look underneath your bed or a closet or somewhere they're hidden, or in another toy box. And then others are missing altogether. So this is what I encountered whenever Jacksonville Historical Society first asked me to talk about the Hispanics in the Jacksonville area. They showed me some documents that they did have, but of course they stopped at about when the Woos and the Mendez and the Riveras disappeared. So I kind of didn't have not anything to go on in some respects. So I did what comes naturally to me. I thought, okay, well, let's get some oral histories from people. Let's go into the Hispanic community here in Jacksonville, and we'll start with the people who are the most visible. So that's what I did. Fortunately, I had two individuals and organizations that assisted me with the project, and I'm so grateful for that. And one of them is the First Coast Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and we have their representative, Maria Isabela Montoya, here today with us. And they believed in my project so much that they're now sponsoring me for the phase 2 of the project. So I'm just so honored that this can happen. And she has her own business, and she's decided also to be my sponsor. So my advantage, that advantage is now sponsoring me. And she just told me on the ride up here that UNF is now sponsoring my work. So I'm very excited. It's actually the, Maria, please forgive me, or correct me if I'm incorrect, if I'm wrong. It's the Department of Business for the, let me see, for the MBA, International MBA program. There, I got it right.
International Business Program, plus MBA International MBA.
Okay, so it's the International MBA program that is sponsoring me with Dr. Andres Gallo, who I actually interviewed. So I'm glad you remembered. So anyhow, I'm just so grateful because they were the ones that were instrumental in getting the people for me to interview. Also, I have to thank, and he's obviously not here, but the chair of the Duval County Democratic Hispanic Caucus, Mario de Punto. He also has the television program on 218 Jacks, so he had a lot of contacts in the community as well. So I think the stars in the heavens were aligned whenever it was time for me to start doing these oral histories, and it took off, and before I knew it, I had 40 oral histories that I filed. So I'm very, very thankful for that. But these were gathered during the peak of the pandemic in 2021. So my hands were tied a little bit, but I was able to use Zoom. And so thank God for Zoom. So what I did was to try and fill in the gaps, as I said, in the Spanish history or Hispanic history of North Florida. So next slide, please. Okay, 1930 to 1940. We're going to go by decades. In 1931, there was a Guatemalan consul called Emilio Carlos. I was able to gather that data. And very interestingly, in 1937, Harry Gonzalez, a Floridano from Pensacola, moved into the Jacksonville area. It was very interesting the way I got his name. Is because one of the members of the Jacksonville Historical Society called me one day and said, you know, I remember a gentleman by the name of Harry Gonzalez, and he used to be a very prominent businessman in the area, and I worked with him at Wayland and something and other. I have the name, but I can't find my notes right now, so anyway, you'll have to forgive me. But he did come here originally working for GM, then he worked for several different companies, and he eventually opened up his own consulting firm called Gonzalez Industries or Gonzalez Associates. And he ended up being a golf course community developer. So he was also a founding board member of Flagler College, I found out. And then he was appointed by Governor Claude Kirk in 1967 to the State Road Board and to the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. So I was just fascinated by this gentleman. He was president of United Way Jacks, and he was a founding member of the Mental Health Clinic of Duval County, and then also president of the state organization. And he was an officer in the Jacks Chamber of Commerce in their, I think it's a rather exclusive club, and it's called the Committee of 100. So where did I find all this? From an obituary in the Palm Beach Post. So he actually moved down to Palm Beach in 1985 when he retired. So that's how I was able to track him down and the information. But I'm so thankful. Who knew that a fellow member of the Historical Society would be able to give me such a great lead. So I'm very thankful for these kind of hints. And by the way, if you all know of any Hispanics in the Nassau County area that might have been here at one time and active, please send that my way. I would appreciate it. Okay, here we go to the next slide. 1940 through 1950, not much was happening. The 1940 census says that there were 25,000 Hispanics in Florida. There was no data for 1950 or 1960. It was just left blank. In 1940 through 1947, there's an entry about the Argentine consulate, and his name was Ramon Mureta. Okay, next slide. 1950 through 1960, things start to heat up a little bit more. In 1953, Manuel Rivera, he was, if you recall, the owner of the tap room La Villa area, or La Villa area, he happened to house a young African-American baseball player by the name of Hank Aaron. Anyone remember Hank Aaron? Am I dating myself? Actually, what happened was that the young Hank Aaron, at the beginning of his baseball career, was playing at Derby Field, and apparently he was being harassed, racially negative comments and things like that. So Mr. Rivera said, "Hey, let's come to my house. I'll give you room and board, and it'll be fine." So that's what happened. And of course, as we all know, Hank Aaron went on to much greater things. So in 1957, Padrita Mendez, if you recall, her father had the tailor shop. She was a daughter of Pedro Mendez. She left Jacksonville, actually, to study opera at Columbia University in New York City. And she got her master's degree in opera in New York and got a Fulbright scholarship to study in Italy. So when she was in Italy, she ended up performing in operas there and toured all across Europe. And also, the film industry, the Italian film industry grabbed her, and she starred or was in several roles there in the Italian films. So this was all taken from my colleague Ennis Davis from the Jackson, and then other information. So I thought that was very interesting, and her oral history is actually housed at the University of Miami, if I'm not mistaken. So she has become really quite a bit of a celebrity. In 1957, this man is very near and dear to my heart. Clark Vargas, owner of C. Vargas and Associates, opened a civil and environmental engineering firm, and he ended up loving guns. How can I put it? Guns. But he developed or he designed shooting ranges. Since he was an engineer, he was able to fix everything and calculate everything, and apparently has some kind of patent even on a particular type of blind or something that is used. He explained this all to me, and of course it went right over my head. But he is owner of this Vargas and Associates, and he's going to come into play in the next few years, as we'll see. In the 1950s, the Cubans began slowly trickling again into the Jacksonville area due to political unrest in Cuba. There was a dictatorship again with General Batista, and a young revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro was starting to wreak havoc in the area. So next slide, please. In 1960 through the 70s, Wilfredo Gonzalez, and he is now, what is he, a chairman of the board?
He's the chairman of the board, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce.
Of the First Coast Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He first came to Jacksonville through the U.S. Navy. And that's one thing that I found out, was that many people who were stationed with the U.S. Navy ended up loving the area and stayed here. Never left for here. What they did, they came back. In 1961, Dr. Armando Piedra immigrated from Cuba and began teaching at Edward Waters College. And in 1961, a very interesting baseball promoter by the name of Bobby Maduro escaped Cuba for Jacksonville, Florida. He's a Cuban baseball promoter, very, very famous over there. And he's a baseball owner and just essentially a mogul, or mogul, however you pronounce it. And he owned the Havana Sugar Kings. And he brought the team to where? Jacksonville. So I think they've kind of like had several lives now. I think maybe now the Jumbo Shrimp, and they were another team before that. But nevertheless, he was the one who brought the team here in the 1960s. In 1967, the Cuban American Club opened and established in Jacksonville, and Roberto Mudez was one of the founders. His daughter, Gigi Rosario, was able to tell me about his kind of being the mayor of the Cuban community there in Jacksonville, and how if anyone was coming, new immigrants would come into the city, that he would teach them how to drive, he would take them to different places where they could find assistance. So he was really very helpful. And he was also a reporter with the Times-Union. So I was finding out about all these wonderful details. And I still have to look him up as well, and I wanted to see some of the articles that he might have written. In 1968, Hispanic Heritage Week was created, and it was a week back then, and not a month like it is now. In 1970s, next slide please. Well, I think the Cubans came back to Florida. Our population of Hispanics increased to 860,000. So definitely in those 30 years, it went from 25,000 to 860,000. So that's a really monumental leap there. In 1970, a very interesting ballerina with Cuban ancestry, Dulce Anaya, opened up the Jacksonville Ballet Theater. And I think if you would look her up, she's most famous in the Jacksonville area for having the production of the Nutcracker during the Christmas time era. Also, she was featured on Univision in Miami, and they did a beautiful, beautiful documentary on her life. But she's a very fascinating individual. She's very petite, which is unlike what we're used to seeing ballerinas like, you know, they're very tall and statuesque. Well, she's very tiny and petite. And at first, she was not really considered seriously, but she was so good that as a teenager in Cuba, she was accepted into the American Ballet Theater in New York. And of course, then after that, she moved to Europe. She was a prima ballerina all over Europe, and then she came back in 1970 and opened up the dance studio and then the ballet theater. So in 1979, does anyone know Ken Amaro? Ken, what is it, on your side? Anyone remember him? Yeah. He first came to Jacksonville in 1979, and he studied broadcast journalism at Jones College, which is now no longer in existence. But interestingly enough, he began working part-time at First Coast News, and he never left. 42 years later, he retired from First Coast News. He was the first Afro-Latino reporter and broadcaster in Jacksonville. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm having difficulty. My iPad is now malfunctioning, but I'm going to look over here then. In 1981, Pastors Joffrey and Elia Vivoni opened up the first Spanish-speaking Protestant church in Jacksonville, called the Jacksonville Hispanic Church of God. It's very interesting because if you Google Spanish-speaking churches, that's the first one that pops up. And I think it's because they've been here the longest, possibly, and they have the most notoriety, let's say, or popularity. I spoke with Pastora Vivoni, and she has so many connections in the community. She works with the Mayo Clinic. She holds health clinics for her congregation. She's always involved in community activities. So she is really a very dynamic individual, her and her ministry. In 1985, Victor Quota arrived with the U.S. Navy. Here's another individual that loved Jacksonville and never left. And he began the Hispanic Cultural Festivals for Jacks. I know that he held one very famous one, I think during one of those Puerto Rican holidays. It's a religious holiday, but it's where they go to the ocean and they walk into the ocean backwards. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember. Is it the other Salon or something like that? I keep on forgetting the name of the celebration, but he was very famous for that. And unfortunately, that stopped, but it did have an impact, and I discovered a lot of information on him and the archives at the library, or at the Historical Society. In 1988, Dr. Judith Rodriguez, a nutritionist, was hired by UNF with the goal of opening a nutrition program for the Brooks College of Health there at UNF. And so she instituted the program, and she was the first Hispanic professor on the faculty there for nutrition. And of course, she's received many accolades, and she's received many awards, and has published extensively. So she's been very big in the Hispanic community and has worked side by side with the health department on different brochures and projects for the community. Okay, 1990, next slide, through 2000. I told you Victor Cota was a mover and a shaker and never went home. Well, he founded the first radio station called Latin Beat Radio. It was on 3 hours on the weekends only. And for years, apparently, that was the only radio station that Latinos could listen to. But he had a very popular program. In 1992, El Heraldo Latina newspaper was founded by Carlos Miranda, and it was the first Spanish newspaper in North Florida. That's no longer in existence. It was replaced, or it was taken, their spot was taken by Hola News, which is now the premier newspaper for Latinos here in the Jax area. In 1992, Ed's Spanish-American Cookery opened up in Jacksonville. And this guy, Ed Marcial, was one lucky fellow. He won the lottery for $5,000, and with that money, he opened up his restaurant. So thanks to the lotto, right? And in 1994, Havana Jack's restaurant opened up in Jacksonville. And of course, it was the first Cuban restaurant in the area, and it was owned and operated by Renee and Sylvia Pulido. Now, here's an instance about a husband who has an idea, opens it up, and then leaves it for the wife to finish. He opened it up. A year later, he tells Sylvia, you know, I think I need to concentrate more on my mechanic in the automotive business, so you take over the restaurant. So she did, and she's been running it ever since. She put 3 sons through medical school with Havana Jacks. She's a remarkable woman, and I think she's one of the leading business people here in the area, and is much to be admired. Okay, so next slide, please. 1990 to 2000. I'm gonna have to get a drink of water. Remember I told you Clark Vargas was going to come into play again? Well, in 1992, they created the Hispanic American Business Association, called HABA. It was founded by Clark Vargas, Jose Perez, Sergio Arnaiz, and Jorge Hernandez. They were all business owners. Why did they own it? It was in response to discrimination against Hispanics in the set-aside contracts by the city of Jacksonville. So they were a little bit hot under the collar, and they decided that they would go ahead and form their organization, and also that they would start going to all the city council meetings and become more known in the community. And so they did, and it was a very successful project that they put through. And the city did do a discrimination program and filed there's a booklet, or a book, that they ended up printing and distributing, and it indeed did show that there was discrimination against Hispanics by the city of Jacksonville. So it was not all in vain, and since then they stayed in the community and they have become a force in the community. In 1996, when Fredo Gonzalez came back to Jacksonville from the Navy, He had gone off to New York, studied there, and then went to Washington, D.C., where he served in several presidential administrations and became the director for the Small Business Administration here in North Florida. And of course, the SBA assists many Hispanic and minority businesses in the area and really leads them on the pathway towards success. In 1996, Ed Perez arrived with CSX, I think that's the railroad company, and he was its technical director. And he was a Cuban emigre from 1963. When he came here in 1963, he witnessed massive bombing and artillery fire in his hometown in Cuba. And he was a child of maybe 10, 11, 12, and he came here and he said, I was suffering from PTSD and I didn't know it. I just was angry, I didn't know what to do. And so fortunately, he found his way, and I'm going to talk about him in a second. Next slide, please. In 1997, Alejandra Amelín arrived in Jacksonville, again with the U.S. Navy. That Navy is bringing a lot of Latinos to the area, huh? And they like it here. They like the nice weather. And she's founder of the Jax Natural Healing Center. They have chiropractors there. They have, she told me just recently that they now have an acupuncturist, and then they have a lot of yoga classes. So it's a natural healing center, and it's I think it's a great industry that she has gone into and to help people here. So in 1998, Tomas Jimenez founded the Mayor's Hispanic American Advisory Board under Mayor John Delaney and began meeting once per month. There were 11 members, and I think now there are less because of the COVID times, and I don't think they've replenished their numbers. And then in 1999, Tomas Jimenez decided that he would go ahead and start a scholarship called Achieving the Dream for Latino youth in Jacksonville. Next slide, please. In 2000, Julio Fuentes came and created and founded the Florida State Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and it was in Jacksonville. It's now moved its headquarters to West Palm Beach, but he was very proud and he said, you know, I think that's something. Jacksonville is the first, and I created it right and founded it right here in Jacksonville. So I was very fortunate that I was able to interview him. In 2002, Dr. Andres Gallo, the director, created the UNF's Global MBA program. And of course, it's now grown, and he's got worldwide connections. It's amazing how many countries that he has programs that go into for students in the International Business Program. In 2003, I made a typo and I said Jose Lopez, but it should be Jorge Lopez, founded the first 24-hour radio station, Caliente Radio, which means hot. So he's open. This gentleman is really something. He's a real entrepreneur. And he opened 10 radio stations in Jacksonville. I think he's probably opened all of the Hispanic stations in Jacksonville, if you ask me. But he's opened them for North Sand Media, which is a company that's based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, I believe. And then also iHeartRadio, which is very popular, I know, among people now. And in 2003, this organization, founded by Clark Vargas, if you remember, HAVA changed its name. What did it change its name to? The First Coast Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So they've had quite a history, to say the least, in Jacksonville. And of course, I thank them very much for being my sponsor. Next slide, please. In 2000 and 2010, one very, very dynamic woman, Annie Grogan, arrived in Jacksonville and founded and was the CEO of the Hispanic Institute for Life and Leadership of the First Coast. The Hill was the short term. It was a nonprofit association for women in business. She has been very instrumental in launching careers for many Hispanic women in the Jacksonville community, and very dynamic, and has been working with different companies altogether. Now she is working for the SBA, so she's, I think she's a perfect fit. In the 2003, they had some Hispanic awards, and the honorees included Dr. Edith Perez from Mayo Clinic, Ya Gozo, which is a Latin band, Derek Garcia Sepulveda, and he was the Hispanic Softball League, Maribel Hernandez from Jack's Airport Authority, and Judith Rodriguez from UNF, a nutritionist. So she's been honored. And of course, who else? Sylvia Foley, the owner of Havana Jacks. So I think these women have done outstanding jobs for the community, and they're being honored. They were honored in 2003. 2004, the Jack's Puerto Rican population rises due to the base closure. And we were lucky enough that in 2004, Yanira Cardona arrived in Jacksonville because her father was in the Navy and was transferred to Mayport. And so she eventually became CEO of Yaya Productions. She's a cultural promoter. And if you see virtually any kind of cultural program that's going on in Jacksonville, Yaya is probably behind it. So she's a very dynamic individual. And she came here in 2004, was 17 years old, and she immediately got a job with radio. You meet her, her personality is so bubbly, she's perfect. Next slide. In 2000 through 2010, another radio personality came here, Millie Colon. And she worked for Latino Hits Radio and for Caliente Radio. She's a very dynamic individual and is currently on iHeartRadio with Jorge Lopez. In 2010, First Coast Hispanic Chamber took over the Achieving the Dream Scholarship. So if you've seen any flyers about Achieving the Dream Scholarship, it's now run by First Coast Hispanic Chamber, and they do a phenomenal job. It's grown, and Nadia, do you have any figures about how many young people they helped this year with scholarships?
We are awarding this year around 20 students. Each student is getting around $2,500 per scholarship, more or less. And in the past 20 years, more or less, we are giving away $600,000 to the students that can study heritage. We are working very hard. We have a sponsorship with our foundation, and also we receive a lot of donations. We want to donate to these students, and we are so happy. And this year we have the gala. The gala is in October 20th, when we are celebrating these students in jazz.
Okay. Next slide, please.
I have a question.
Certainly.
With the scholarship, do they just do an application and there's a committee that reaches
Yes.
them and selects?
It's a lot of things that they have to do.
Yeah.
They have to put in the state, think about the different things that they're asking, and they have a committee that they select the students. The committee became Florida Blue. Florida Blue is one of our sponsors. Florida Blue, Win Dixie is another sponsor. There's people from a lot of institutions and getting into the committee, and also Duval County School District is getting into the committee, and they are selecting the students from that list.
Okay, in the interest of time, the last one I'm going to remember or talk about is Betsy Santiago. She was the first Hispanic woman to be appointed as the special assistant to Jacksonville Mayor, then Jacksonville Mayor Alvin Brown. So she was really one of the first Hispanics in the political arena in Jacksonville, and I think she's been the only one. In 2014, Mario Gagundo founded the Duval County Democratic Hispanic Caucus in Jacksonville. And of course, our own Maria Isabela Montoya in 2013 arrived in Jacksonville, and she's CEO of My Advantage Marketing and Advertising. And do you know that this young woman here started her first business at age 17? And it was successful. More importantly, most importantly. But yes. So we have a lot of talented people in our midst. Next slide, please. Okay, and so that's about it. The last, in 20, yeah, there we go, to the present. The latest, I'm going to go ahead and go for 2022. The Northeast Florida Resource Award was given, that's okay. Nespira is the newest nonprofit in town, and they are helping immigrant community. Okay, so now we're going to see part of the Voces de Hispanos for the Jacksonville.
We met in the Cuban American Club when there was like maybe 10 families that were Cuban, and here in Jacksonville we're both Cuban, and God put us together here, not in Cuba, and that would be rare for you to meet another Cuban person here in high school. So that was really odd. And my mother had met him before me at the Cuban club at some function. I never used to go much, but I was invited to a dance, a senior dance there for a Cuban American children's family, and I met him there. There's a Cuban American club. It was off of Phillips Highway, I believe, and they used to have it used to be a building, and it had a softball field, and it had a pool, and Cubans would go there on the weekends. They would play dominoes, they would have dances, they would have meals, they would just spend the weekend there. They would go there to the club, my dad would go there to play poker with a lot of Cuban doctors that my dad was friends with. A lot of Cuban doctors came, and they passed, and they did well, and they were practicing medicine here. They had all kinds of people, and my dad was one of the founders. And his name is Roberto, Roberto Mures, Mures, and he was very much liked. He was like a mayor, they used to call him, because anybody that would come into the city that just got here from Cuba or a lot of another Hispanic, mainly Cubans, he would find them jobs, he would take them places, he would teach them how to drive, he would take them to the Lutheran social services. He was like so missed when he passed away. He was a people person. I mean, I'm telling you. But yeah, the Cuban American Club is on Phillips Highway. Then they switched it to off of Sunbeam Road. They had to move. They had to sell it for some reason. The committee, and those men have died off, and unfortunately their children, they didn't keep it. Like I can say I'm guilty that even though my dad was a founder, but in the busyness of my life, it wasn't a Christian thing. So I said, I have to get my energy in things of God. And then they made it a Hispanic Latin club. That didn't work either. Then finally they sold it to the Catholic Charities, the building and the place, but it died off.
So I actually started working at UNF in 1988. And at the time, the University of North Florida did not have a nutrition program. And then I think around 1987, they started the College of Health. And they had one person who used to teach nutrition classes to the nursing students because it's required. And I worked for about 2 years as an advisor. And then in the either 90 or early 90s, it got accredited. And that's when I moved into the faculty position. When I mentioned that it was only 1.7% Hispanic, my husband and I are fairly acculturated, I think I would say, but we still like Spanish culture and Spanish food, and we really love it. We were upset that we weren't getting an ability to practice Spanish with anybody, and that we couldn't hear Latin music anywhere. And then we found out that there was a Latin band in town. And so we went to listen, and my husband plays instruments, so he approached them afterwards, and they got him in the band. So it was great because I would say for a good 20 years at least, he played with the band. And so we created a set of friends with a
with the
common
company for two
cultural
years.
interest.
When I moved here, I was looking for radio stations, for media companies, and the only station that it was a Spanish station. It was, I think it was just on the weekend for a few hours. Victor Cora have that station. It was, I think the name it was Latin Beat and there was just a one local newspaper, and that person she offered me like a type of partnership, and I started working with the newspaper, and a year after we start working, we opened the first 24 hours radio station here in Jacksonville. That was in 2003. We opened the station Latino Hits 1160. Back in 2003, I remember that we pulled the census number. It was 55,000 Hispanic in Jacksonville. Any place that you went, right, and you hear somebody that actually speaks Spanish, you're like, what surprise! Like, wow, it's somebody that actually speaks Spanish here. That's awesome. Because we took us what 20 years now, just to be in the number that we always want to be, which is 10% of the population. Then in 2005, another investor, they bought that station, the 11cc, and he said, okay, you can stay with the company. You're gonna be now my general manager, and we bought another two stations. That was in 2000, I think 2006. And 2000, and actually have it here in 2010, we opened the first FM station in Jacksonville. That was Caliente 105.3. And that was another group of radio. They hired me to open that station. In 2013, the Northern Group, that was the group that actually bought the station in 2005. They hired me back, and they opened another FM. And then they bought another FM in 2014. That I'm gonna give you the whole radio history of Jacksonville. And in 2017, we opened. iHeartMedia this opened the first FM Spanish station. For the group. That means that was in 2017. We opened Rumba 106.9. Since then, I kept working with iHeartMedia, and now we have another FM. We have the first news talk stations in Jacksonville. I think so far I've been involved in ten launchings of Hispanic
Coming to live
station in
here, I definitely noticed that there was no real ethnic representation for Hispanics. Like I didn't feel like there was like any Hispanic kind of community. Like the Hispanics were maybe spread out. There was some little stores here and there. You never heard anybody speaking Spanish anywhere. If you hear people speaking Spanish, like you'd almost want to like go up to them and like ask them who they were, or it didn't really dawn on me to get involved in the community until I got here, and I realized there was such an absence of representation, and we still don't have any elected officials in Jacksonville that are Hispanic, and we don't have any Hispanics as representatives in Tallahassee. We don't have any city council people. We don't have any school board people. There are some people who are, that work in City Hall. At least there used to be. I don't know about now with this mayor. There's definitely an absence of that. So when I came here and I saw that there was like no ethnic diversity and there was no Hispanic representation, that's what really, made me learn more. And a friend of mine, told me about the local Democratic Party, and so I started learning about, the state Hispanic caucus, and how they're a separate entity from the local city DECs. So I'm currently still, the president of the Democratic Hispanic Caucus. It's been like 6 or 7 years now. When Trump got elected, I was the chair of the Mayor Hispanic Board, and I was elected by my peers. I wasn't appointed by the mayor. It was at that time that I realized that we really needed to do something that kind of helped strengthen the image of Hispanics in Jacksonville, because I felt like there was this horrible cloud, that was coming through. And so we decided to do the Hispanic Film Festival. But yeah, it was a good little event. We had a nice turnout, but we couldn't continue doing it.
Hosted 240 delegates from around the entire world. And this is mayors and consuls and student groups and business groups, and it didn't really matter to me. They were all the same. They were all just people. Unfortunately, I kind of messed that up and never took any pictures with any of these people, so I couldn't even begin to tell you who they were. We actually had the consul from Mexico come to visit the mayor one time. And it was really an interesting conversation, because I don't think our mayor, while he knew that I spoke Spanish, I don't think he actually put two and two together. So when the consul was here, obviously he's got his interpreter with him, but we're sitting in the conference room, and I've got the mayor on one side and the consul on the other side. I'm sitting kind of in between the two of them, the translator and everybody else. And somehow I began talking to our consul. He speaks to me in Spanish. I translate to the mayor in English. The mayor speaks to me in English. I translate and speak to him in Spanish. And all of a sudden, by the third time that happened, Mayor Brown looks at me and he says, "You speak Spanish?" I'm like, "Yes, I do." So,
Next video that we're going to be showing is a surprise. It's one of Nassau County's own. I was very, very fortunate to get an interview with Dr. Berta Arias. And so we're going to hear her now.
When my parents found out from the relatives in Cuba that Castro had come in and he was closing everything from newspapers to companies, and this just did not look like what he had promised the people, right? My grandparents encouraged my father to see if he could stay a little bit extra time with this company. And so what became a little bit extra time became we just basically stayed. And again, as a child, I didn't understand really much what was going on. I just saw that all of my uncles and aunts were coming to our house, and they stayed in our house. Our house became kind of like the welcome place for my mother's 5 siblings. They were all younger than she was, and so they stayed with us until they got their own jobs and their own apartments or got married or whatever. So it wasn't really until much later that I realized I had been oblivious to what the politics were, because my parents would not really burden us with that. But I grew up in Chicago. We lived in what's called South Shore, and we were the only Latinos there. We lived in a neighborhood that was basically Polish heritage, and my school was basically, again, people from Polish or European heritage. They had never seen a Latino, or they, couldn't pronounce my name. But basically, my friends were all American. It wasn't until, and high school the same thing. It wasn't until I got into college where I really started making Hispanic friends. And that's really also where I became more of an activist, realizing that my family was in Cuba, middle class, and my father had gone to the University of Havana. So in my family, it wasn't a question really whether any of us would go to college. It was more like what college and what we would do. And when I ended up in college and started making friends, I realized that some of the young students that I was with were not even making it through the first semester. Their families were not understanding of what the rigors of college really are, and so they expected the kids to be able to hold down a full-time job and come home and take care of their brothers and sisters and all of that, and that's what started opening my mind up to, well, no, we're not all the same. And that stayed with me really into, well, it stayed into my future work, so that when I ended up working on a project while I was a doctoral student at Northwestern University, we had the opportunity to just do something over the summer within the Spanish community. And when you mentioned the demographics, Chicago is actually one of the cities with the largest Mexican-American population. And I actually worked an entire summer with migrant workers in northern Illinois, and they were all Mexican workers who, you know what a migrant worker is, and you know their conditions. And so that continued to open my mind already beyond just what the students were going through, just what people from different social strata are going through. And so I think my life has been very much about trying to help any marginalized person. I'm very sensitive to that, and so when I became a professor, I realized that students were being drawn to me because I was the only Latina that had been hired in the longest time. One of the certainly there were no administrators who were Latino at that time. And so I, over the years, have made friends with other people just like me who had made it into college, had graduated, were deans, were professors, were professionals within the academic field. And we ended up working with Miguel del Valle, who was a councilman in Chicago. And with his help and his contacts, those of us who were interested in improving the chances of Latino students, and particularly first-generation students, we formed an organization that now next year will be celebrating 30 years. I was the president, I was the first president, and I was president there for 10 years. It's called ILACHE, the acronym, Illinois Latino Council on Higher Education. And our membership is from I would say at this point in time, every university and college in Illinois. And what we did in a very incremental way was at our own institutions, when we started, there were probably 8 or 9 of us, trying to make our administrators aware of the need for entry into the world of perhaps some success for yourself in future generations. So anyway, we formed this ILACHE group, still around 30 years later. I'm still involved with them. I have a scholarship that I give out every year. It's a small scholarship, but I mentor some of the students as well, because our hope is that they see that being Latino, speaking Spanish, respecting your culture, and also respecting the culture we're in, but understanding that there's a synergy that happens when cultures come together. And so our group has managed to graduate, and we have many, mainly success stories from first-generation students who've gone through their own universities, but our organization keeps that going. And because I love international things, cultures, not just Hispanic, in Illinois also a similar association that celebrated 35 years last year, and I was invited back as an honoree, is the International Studies and Programs Consortium. And in that group, my focus was to bring international and cultural perspectives across the curriculum. And our colleges and universities, again, from across Illinois, tried to do that. So even though, as a Cuban American, obviously that's my love, but I don't think it should stop there. It should not stop there. It should be about making the world a safer, more vibrant place for people of all cultures and backgrounds. We have a lot to contribute.
Well, that's all on today's program. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm up for questions.
In the beginning, when they come out, they were Afro-Latinos. So there's a connection between the Black community and the Latino community from way back then. And then when Alvin Brown was there, he elected the first Hispanic woman into a position. So to me, that was kind of interesting that, over time, the link,
Yes.
resurfaced.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting the way everything kind of comes full circle, I think, because the Afro-Latinos have had a great influence in Jacksonville as well. You could see with Pedro Mendez, and then they stayed in La Villa, or La Villa. Sorry, I keep on giving my Spanish pronunciation. They stayed in La Villa, in that area. And I've been desperately trying to get to see if there are any other Afro-Latinos that I can speak to about the community, because I have a feeling that there's a lot of lost history that might be there. So anyhow, yes,
I was
please.
the last, I guess, it's Dr. Arias.
Dr.
How
Arias?
did she come to Nassau County? We heard all about her background in Chicago, growing up.
Yes, she retired and she came here on an investigational trip to Amelia Island in 2005. And she said that she was going to be here for 2 weeks, I think, on vacation. And she fell in love with it. Within a few days of even being here, she bought or put a down payment on a house or on a piece of property. And I think she also bought some property out in American Beach.
Yeah, her house is built.
And so that was that. Since 2005, I think is what she said. Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Okay, well, if there are no other questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Rebecca.
It's also been involved in the trust and the tree.
And the tree.
The Tree Conservancy.
Yeah, she's very, I know she's still an activist. She still maintains her activist status. Okay, well, thank you so much. And remember, Somos Familia. We are a family.
Thank you all. Yes.
Thank you. You run a very nice program.